Okay, folks, so let's get going. So today we'll have to move to Karl Marx. Let's get the years. So probably one of the best known names in the entire book to you. So maybe we can start by just kind of listening what we know and what we think we know about Karl Marx. So you certainly heard about the guy, about Marx, and Marxism, and Marxist philosophy, and Marxist economic theory. So what do you know about Marx? Let's start with that. If I were to ask you, give me just a short description of what do you think about Marx? What do you know about Marx?
Addressing the industry as like a class struggle.
Oh, so his theory is class struggle. Okay. That's an important concept. How we will talk about class struggle. What else? What was Marx's nationality? Which country he came from? Germany. He was of Jewish ancestry, but he was a kind of secular, non-practicing Jew. He repudiated, I think, his Jewishness. His mother tongue was German.
Wow, I was thinking, like, when it was talking in the book, I was confused. Like, he mentioned, like, he got, like, expelled or whatever, exiled. Why did the German government exile? Or
because he was still in trouble, political trouble. So he was exiled after 1884 was this revolution all across Europe, which was eventually crushed by the, let's say, reactionary forces, especially in Germany. That happened, and Marx was a political radical from his very youth, and he was expelled from. At that time, Germany was not a single country. He used to live in what is nowadays this Westphalian province of northwestern Germany. He was expelled first to Belgium, and eventually he ended up in London, which had profound implications for his further development. He encountered British political economy and the British Industrial Revolution. So he was an exile, German exile. He spent most of his life in exile, which had significant consequences for himself. He was estranged from German culture and German philosophy very much. Indeed, although the early influences, you will see that there are maybe three distinct intellectual influences on Karl Marx, and one of them is German philosophy. And some modern interpreters of Marx think that this early philosophical influence of German philosophy was the most significant one. So you probably heard about, this is the name if you want to study more Marxism. Polish philosopher who used to be a Marxist, then broke away from Marxism, became a critic of Marxism, and wrote a large 3-volume study called Main Currents of Marxism, Leszek Kolakowski. Main Currents of Marxism. That's the best single book about Marxism. It's a history of Marxism from the intellectual sources in Neoplatonism and ancient philosophy and medieval and early modern mystics and German philosophy and so on, until Marx and Engels, and then he follows the Lenin and Stalin and modern Marxism and Western Marxism and all kinds of meanderings of Marxist thought. It's a very thoroughgoing 3-volume study in terms of Marxism. He begins the first volume with the following sentence: Karl Marx was a German philosopher, period. That's in his view what best describes Karl Marx. Karl Marx's worldview, Karl Marx's economic theory, I mean, his vision of the historical development, his notions of history, after all, his notions of class struggle as an engine of history. That's a typical idea prevailing in Hegelian philosophy. So Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, you've heard of that name. Hegel, German. Nobody heard about Hegel. That's maybe the most important German philosopher of the early 19th century. So you have this tradition, late 18th, early 19th century, sometimes called German classical philosophy. And here with this German classical philosophy, you have, guys, Immanuel Kant, with K. Then a guy called Fichte, Jacob Gottlieb Fichte. All of them have like 4 or 5 names, I'm going to give you abbreviated. Schelling and Hegel. So all of that is between 1780 and 1830. It's 4 years maybe. These are 2 or 3 generations, 4 big philosophers of German early modern, German early philosophy. So Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason, the first significant cornerstone book of this tradition is 1783. And Hegel dies in 1831. Hegel and Schelling were buddies and schoolmates. They studied theology, which is very important, very interesting. They studied theology in Tübingen, alongside another guy whom you may have heard about from your studies of literature, poetry, Friedrich Hölderlin. Hölderlin, poet, German poet, probably the leading romantic poet of all of Europe, Germany. Unfortunately, he ended up in a lunatic asylum. Actually, not. He was isolated by his family, locked up in a house until his death, because he lost his mind in his late 20s, early 30s. Schelling and Hegel came to be very influential figures in political life. Hegel was a professor of philosophy later on at the Berlin Academy, which is a prestigious position that he had. He competed here against Arthur Schopenhauer, another German figure you might have heard about. They didn't like each other, so on. But Marx doesn't belong to the Schopenhauer-Nietzsche tradition of German philosophy. Marx belongs to this tradition, and particularly he was influenced by Hegel. So you cannot understand what Marx was all about, what Marx's theory was, unless you understand at least in rough outlines what Hegel's philosophy is, especially Hegel's philosophy of law and philosophy of history. These were crucial for Marx's own understanding of history. So Marx, at one level, one thing that we can say about him is that he was an economist, but he was also a philosopher, and primarily philosopher. He studied philosophy in Germany. His doctoral dissertation was about Democritus and Leucippus, about the Greek materialistic philosophy, atomism. So he was a philosopher under the influence of Hegel. He was an economist. The main influence was obviously British school of political economy. British. So Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Malthus. You will find that he mentions Malthus in this excerpts from Das Kapital, his major work. In a certain sense, my BA thesis was about how Hegel, and I studied philosophy, how Hegel tried to reconcile British political economy with the German philosophy. And Hegel himself, actually, you can see that Hegel's philosophy of history was already a kind of tried to incorporate elements of British political economy to it. So Karl Marx, as an economist, he was also a philosopher to some degree. He was influenced also by Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Especially Rousseau's disquisition on inequality, study on inequality, the origins of inequality. And he picked up this disdain for inequality and disdain for alienation, concept of alienation. And he would then reappropriate or reformulate in an economistic manner. Rousseau was first to show how division of labor and trade create alienation. Alienate people from themselves, from other people in the community, separate and fragment society, organic unity of society, fragment the organic unity of society, and also alienates them from the products of their own labor. We'll see the explanation that Marx gives for that, but that's one very important influence that is much more pronounced and visible in the early writings of Karl Marx in the 1840s, for example, but could be followed up to his mature works, primarily Das Kapital. That's the major two-volume study. Das Kapital, German. Capital. Study of capital. By the way, Karl Marx was the inventor of the term capitalism. Capitalist mode of production, capitalist system, and so on. That's Karl Marx's invention. He was a philosopher who, at age approximately 24, 25, decided to stop reading philosophy. And according to his own later recollections, he never read anything. After the age of 24 and 25, he never read anything, any philosophical writings anymore, that he devoted almost entirely his energies to studying, to two things: studying economics, what he called political economy, which meant primarily studying British authors, Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, Ricardians, entire movement of epigons and followers of David Ricardo, most of them socialist. That's number one, studying British political economy, and number two, studying conditions of the economic life in Britain. Factory life and poverty rate and economic conditions, empirical analysis of conditions in Great Britain. And finally, political organizing, trying to organize a communist party, socialist party. Workers, movement of workers, or socialist movement. So you can say that Karl Marx was maybe the most significant socialist ideologue or philosopher in history, the most important ideologue of socialism. You know which term he used for his own version of socialist philosophy? It's a very weird term. Scientific socialism. Scientific socialism. As opposed to socialism that prevailed in his own time, which he called socialist utopianism. So what was socialist utopianism? That was a name for all kinds of philosophical systems that different people proposed all across Europe, in England, in France, in Germany, proposing different concepts or ideas how to abolish capitalism and impose socialism. Trying to describe what the conditions of life in future socialist society should be or could be, what kind of political system there will be, and so on and so forth. So they created all kinds of utopias. There's images of a future society that never existed before. So you know who was the first utopian philosopher? What do you think? One guy wrote a book called Utopia. Who was that? An English writer. Sir Thomas More. Utopia. But who was the first philosopher to conceive of a philosophical system of future society that never existed before, according to certain ideals?
Didn't like Plato?
Yeah, Plato. Plato's Republic is a utopian regime. There has never been anything like a society ruled by philosopher kings, and yet he develops this utopian vision of a better future society. For Marx, all of that was bunk. All of that was unscientific. All those ideas about creating one or another utopia. Probably the contributing factor to Marx's, let's say, resistance to the concepts of utopianism was that many of those utopias were pretty weird. Guys like Fourier, Charles Fourier in France, or Robert Owen in England, people like that. They have all kinds of very strange ideas of what socialism would like. Fourier claimed, for example, that once capitalism was abolished and private property was abolished, that's what they were after from the very beginning. The oceans will turn into lemonade, and the roasted chickens will fly into the mouths of comrades, and everybody will be happy, and there wouldn't be any pain and suffering anymore. All kinds of ideas resembling some of the millennialist concepts that we find in medieval mystics and medieval Christian heretics of the 14th and 15th centuries and so on. That Kolakowski would say essentially that even Marxism was a Christian heresy, essentially. You will see in which sense exactly that was the case. So then Marx said, no, that's unscientific. I was concocting all kinds of crazy utopias and describing what the future society would look like. That's unscientific. What is scientific? Oh, you need to understand Hegel in order to understand what is scientific. Scientific means to discover the inexorable iron laws of history. History develops according to the certain laws that are predetermined, fixed, and that you can understand if you understand history very well. So now, Hegel developed his own conception or philosophy of history as an advance or a progress of the consciousness about liberty. So Hegel was an idealistic philosopher. Hegel. Consciousness of liberty. That means that liberty gets better and better understood and appreciated over time. It doesn't mean that liberty will triumph in political reality at every stage, but the intellectual forms of understanding of liberty advance and progress over time. Eventually, political institutions will conform to that. And the reason why political reality will bend to the ideas is that the ideas rule the world. Ideas matter. So Hegel is an idealistic philosopher. So that's one idea. And this evolution of the consciousness of liberty goes through various stages, from the very primitive period until French Revolution, which is the final fulfillment, the end of history, according to Hegel. And liberty is finally fully realized in the domain of mind and thinking, if not in concrete reality. Now, how history then advances? Real history as opposed to intellectual history. Hegel uses a concept that he calls, that is essentially appropriation or misappropriation of Adam Smith's concept of invisible hand. Hegel calls it cunning of reason. That individual statesmen, politicians, individual historical actors, they follow their own selfish interests, their own selfish motives, glory, political power, bloodlust, whatever they want to achieve. But nevertheless, without knowing, without fully understanding that, they're instruments of history, they're instruments of historical progress. Reason that controls history behaves in a cunning fashion, using selfish and greedy politicians and statesmen to achieve their own, to achieve the goals of history. The classical example for him is Napoleon. What is Napoleon? Is a tin-pot dictator, likes power, likes to fight, and nevertheless he serves the purpose of spreading rationalism of the French Revolution across Europe, obliterating feudalism and aristocracy and the remnants of the religious backwardness in Marx's view. So that's the cunning of reason, that the historical reason uses even such a despicable character as Napoleon to achieve certain rational goals. So now you will recognize Adam Smith's work here. Let's say the entrepreneurs are doing their own stuff, seeking profit, but the some kind of invisible hand guides them so as to achieve the results that are not part of their plan. Napoleon doesn't want to achieve liberty and freedom and rationality in Europe, but nevertheless, historical reason uses him in the same sense in which this invisible hand of the market uses individual entrepreneurs to produce better goods at cheaper prices without wanting to achieve that. And selfish historical actors who achieve some higher type of harmony because of the rationality of the process in which they participate. So that's cunning of reason. That's Hegel. Another aspect of Hegelian philosophy that is necessary for Marx. So history advances, history progresses. That's a progressive vision of history in Hegel. It's a progress in the consciousness about liberty. It's usually progress in history, but this progress could be reversed. Hegel says nothing would change. We can imagine tomorrow that the entire world collapses and the Taliban conquer the world and prohibit everything, including playing chess. The remembrance of liberty, the content of people's individual consciousnesses and their mind, the knowledge of liberty would be enough to protect. History would be equally finished, even if the material conditions in the world completely deteriorate. So that's the idealistic inclination of Hegel, or idealistic character of Hegel's philosophy is best seen in that conviction that the crucial role is played by the intellectual development rather than political developments. So intellectual developments developments in the realm of ideas. Cunning of reason, history progresses, progressive vision of history. And finally, struggle, conflict, as a method by which history advances. That's the key idea that is called dialectic, historical dialectic. Dialectical history. So what is dialectics? You have a thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. Hegel describes, if you read, I don't recommend reading Hegel's work because it's terrible. It's very difficult to understand. But what Hegel means by dialectics is actually how contents of individual consciousness develop by intellectual struggle, by intellectual contradictions, how intellectual contradictions create some synthesis that retains the true elements of both of those contradictions in a higher synthesis. So that's the basic idea. You can find it even in the origins of the term. You can find in Plato. In Plato, it's just a name for intellectual discourse. Dialectics goes from dialogos, modern term dialogue. We are in a dialogue, we talk to each other. That means two. Dia means two, and logos. What logos means?
Word.
Yeah, word and 26 other things. It could mean the law. It could mean the principle. It could mean the truth. It could mean the science, biology, Scientology, astrology. Astrology is not a good example, but whatever. So two reasons. It could mean reason, could mean argument, all kinds of things. So two conflicting reasons, principles, arguments, and so on, then create a synthesis. So you know what is an ideal in intellectual, why people consider intellectual debate to be a good thing. Because I have one opinion, you have another opinion. Probably sometimes people interpret this in a vulgar sense that the truth is somehow in between. I may make a slight mistake, you make a slight mistake, and then the truth is somewhere in between. But it's not just that, it's actually the truth is not in between us, it's somehow above us. We can find it, we can climb up the stairs towards the truth only if we are permanently challenged by people who think differently, who question us, who show us the limitations of our worldview. So that's a mechanism. That's a mechanism that in Plato is responsible for intellectual advancement. This Promethean fire that is necessary for philosophy and science, that is lit only when you have a challenge to your worldview. And so for Hegel, that's a universal mechanism that operates not only at the level of individual consciousness, operates in the world as well. Struggle is a mechanism by which justice and liberty are brought into the world. He calls that concept struggle for recognition. Between two competing wills. Struggle for recognition is an engine of history. As just as intellectual challenge creates intellectual advancement, historical, real challenge creates improvement in the conditions of human life. That's the source. That's where Karl Marx learned about class struggle as the mode of history. Okay. And that's where he picked up his dialectic. You probably heard about dialectical materialism. That's the way how Karl Marx and later Lenin described his philosophy. Dialectical materialism. That means that contrary to Hegel, Marx doesn't believe that ideas and consciousness influence what's going to be happening in the real world. It's not that the ideas are perfected first and then the real world follows suit. It's the other way around. Material conditions of life determine what are we going to believe. For Hegel, we're going to be doing whatever we believe. The results, our imprint in reality, will be determined by our ideas that are autonomously created in intellectual development, conversation, and so on. For Marx, is the other way around. Whatever we believe is just an expression of our class interest, of our material conditions of life. It says, social being determines social consciousness. That's Marx's. That's my English translation of the Serbian translation of the German original that I don't know how to say. But social being, the way how we live in society, our experience of social life will determine our ideology, our philosophy, our worldview. If you're a peasant, then you will have a certain worldview that is determined by your social function as a peasant. If you're a proletarian worker, you will have a typical class consciousness, another term that workers have. If you're a bourgeois, if you're a capitalist, you will have a capitalist class consciousness. Now, it shouldn't shock you that for Karl Marx, classical liberalism, emphasizing free trade, individual liberty, constitutional democracy, private property, and so on, is just a bourgeois class consciousness. It's a rationalization of the material privileges of the bourgeois class. So to try to systematize slightly this maze of different things that I introduced here to you, simplify slightly. For Hegel, he took the concept of struggle, dialectic, this dialectical view of history. But contra Hegel, he said in one of Marx's writings, his critique of German ideology, he says that Hegel is like upside down. His world is upside down. He has a good structural view of the world. There's dialectical view, gradual development, progress, another idea, progress. It's very important. Progressive view, history advances. So that's cool. Hegel is right about this, but where he is wrong, according to Marx, is that it's not ideas that determine the conditions of the real world, it's the other way around. Materialism. Hegel should be turned upside down from this idealistic, from essentially being metaphorically set on its head. On Hegel, the world is set on its head, on the content of our thoughts. We should turn it upside down and put the man on 2 feet, firmly rooted in material reality. That's materialism. And this conjunction of these two things create dialectical materialism. History of the entire world is a history of class struggle. That's a quotation from Communist Manifesto, one book that you might have heard about. All previous history of human race was history of class struggle. It's a very sweeping philosophical conclusion. It's a history of class struggle, dialectic struggle, advance, describes material conditions of life, and progress, history to this dialectical scheme. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, history progresses. History has a goal. And here you have certain religious or quasi-religious element in Marxism. So history, another, borrowing from Hegel. Hegel, when you read Hegel's books, for example, Phenomenology of Spirit, he talks about the forms of consciousness and formations of consciousness in mind. It goes first from bare perceptions, or not bare perceptions, bare awareness of the world, raw senses of the world. So it hurts, it smells, so on. And then you have a perception which contains already an element of interpretation. You're thinking about what you are seeing. What is the meaning of the thing that you are seeing here? Already, it's not just a bare sense, raw sense. It already has an element of spirit, element of intellectual transformation in itself. Then you have perception. Then you have consciousness. I'm aware of the elements of my own thoughts, and so on. And then you have self-consciousness. And then you have, after self-consciousness, then spirit further develops and purifies. You have objective consciousness or objective spirit. Those are the forms of societal institutions that have certain meaning and certain purpose. Family, church, state, and so on. So I have a subjective spirit, perception, consciousness, self-consciousness, my own thoughts, my own intellect. Then you have objective reason, objective mind, which is rationality embodied into physical world, family, society, church, laws, and so on. And then you have a synthesis of these three. You have absolute spirit. Those are philosophy and religion that unify both subjective and objective. And he calls all of those. I don't want to bore you too much with going into the details about this philosophy. This is not about Hegel's philosophy, but it's important to show you once again how influenced by Hegel Marx is. Hegel calls those intellectual formations that succeed each other as the spirit develops gradually from bare consciousness eventually to philosophy as the highest possible form of spirit. Those intellectual formations gradually improve, develop by constant struggle, by constant tension between the opposites. What Marx does, he says, no, forget about that. That's nonsense. The only formations that exist are material formations, socio-historical formations. Material formations. What are these materials formations? These are economic systems. That's how history progresses. It doesn't go from subjective consciousness to philosophy as the highest form by the mediation of objective reason, objective Serbian terms are more precise here. So, objective forms of objective mind, objective spirit. It goes from slave economy, Roman Greece, feudal economy, capitalism, socialism. So this entire four-part division of economic history comes from Marx, actually. Slaveholder economy, a feudal economy, capitalist, and socialist. And class struggle among the hostile groups within each one of these systems is what drives this historical development. So you see, all of the hostile classes within the existing systems They fight for themselves. They don't fight for any universal historical ideal. But by the cunning of historical reason that he learned about from Hegel, they achieve step by step, gradually, better and better type of economic system. So feudalism is a bad system, but it's better than slaveholder economy. Peasants have more liberty and better conditions than slaves. Capitalism is bad. Marx criticizes capitalism very much, but capitalism is an enormous improvement as compared to feudalism. When you read, for example, Communist Manifesto, you will see utter disdain that Marx has for those reactionary romanticists who hate capitalism and want to go back to some kind of pre-capitalist feudal society. As Marx, I said, one of the most brilliant intellectual and economic defenses of capitalist globalization is the first 4 or 5 pages of the Communist Manifesto. If you haven't read the book, we don't have it here, but read just the beginning of the Communist Manifesto. You will see how Marx defends capitalism as an economic system against the claims of people who would like to go back to some form of feudalism, pre-capitalist society. So he's pretty consistent in his defense of this progressive view of history. But of course, capitalism is a bad system in and of itself. It has internal contradictions in itself, and eventually those contradictions will lead to the demise of capitalism and creation of socialist or communist world. And that's the end of history, and that's heaven on earth, simply put. All conflict disappears, private property disappears, alienation of man from man, humans from humans, and of humans from the objects of their labor will disappear. Inequality will disappear. Destitution will disappear. It's a sense of perfect happiness and the eradication of class conflict. That's what marks the end of history. Communism will be the final. So Marx uses this inconsistent terminology. Sometimes he talks about socialism, sometimes about capitalism. In most of his writings, he would say that the communism is the final goal, and socialism might be this transitional phase from capitalism to communism. In socialism, you will still have some class relationships, but communism will be the final goal. Because you can say that Karl Marx, deep down, is a kind of religious eschatologist. That's why Kolakowski says that Marxism is one of the most powerful Christian heresies, because there are people who believed in this kind of ideas in the 14th and 15th centuries and even before. Thomas Müntzer and all kinds of mystics in the Middle Ages. Go ahead.
So if Marx believes that each class, or there's a class struggle in between two classes or whatever, so what about like the, I mean, you mentioned Thomas Müntzer, but like a little after that, the Peasants' Rebellion, there's a class struggle, obviously, but there was people like the clergy, there was knights, there was dukes that also fought with the peasants. So how does Marx?
That's a problem. That's one of the problems with Marx, because eventually the situation, how you identify the people from the ruling class and people from the subjugated class. It's always that relationship, the ruling class and subjugated class. He considered Thomas Müntzer to be the precursors of the proletarian revolution, And he would probably say, I forgot, I haven't read that for a while. Engels actually wrote about Thomas Müntzer, if you're interested about that. I don't know what he would have said about that. I don't think that he can answer if you accept the notion that there are the rival members of the ruling class that have conflicting interests, then his schema doesn't apply anymore. But Marx's response would be that all those conflicts are superficial, actually, that what determines all religious conflicts are just nonsense. It's the primacy of material. The primacy of the material reasons determines that all classes, remember, all previous history was a history of class struggle. Even if people have certain religious reasons that they allege, there is always, that's just a mask for a class interest that lurks somewhere in the background. So he was absolutely adamant. He was absolutely adamant. So now, the first reading that we have here is essentially offers a very pithy and brief description of Marx's materialistic worldview. So he says essentially that there are two components, two elements of every given socio-historical formation. Yeah, socio-historical formation. That's the term that he uses for economic systems, essentially. Socio-historical formations. The first one is the key. That's the material base of the socioeconomic formation, which contains two elements. Material base. The first one, which is the key. The first is the relations of production. And the second one is the mode of production. Mode of production in capitalism would be industrial manufacturing, the predominant mode of production. And this mode of production then dictates to some degree the relations of production. What is the relation of production? What is the key relation of production? In capitalism, it's private property. Private property and exploitation of labor by capital that follows from private property. These are the key determinative factors of the modern world. Everything else is just a mirage, it's just a window dressing. This is the key about modern world. So you have a pyramid like this. Here you have relations of production, and you have the mode of production. That's the material base. This part here is called superstructure. And here you have all kinds of things. Philosophy, state or government, ideology, religion, and so on. So all spiritual creations, science, all of these, philosophy, science, ideology, state, law, forms of consciousness, all of them are dictated. They're called intellectual superstructures. You have material base and intellectual superstructure. And on page 395, we have a very brief description of this phenomenon. So in capitalism, you have a philosophy of liberalism. You have the freedom of contract. You have a certain ideological worldview. You have also religion, and so on. These are all just expressions of the prevailing mode of production. In the social production of their existence, found that sentence, social, the beginning towards the beginning of the page, maybe third or fourth sentence. In the social production of their existence, man, social production of their existence means their social life. Men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. So forces of production, forces of production. That's the same thing. Forces of production is technology that they have and method of production. These are called forces of production. So, for example, steam engine is one element of that manufacturing. Assembly line is is a force of production of all of the machines that we use, of course, production. That's a part of the material base, but also the part of material base is the mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of man that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. It's not their social, it's not their consciousness that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness, which means their life within the definite relations of capitalistic production, their roles as peasants or workers or capitalists, and the experience of living as workers and capitalists, and their experience of working in a factory or on land determines what kind of ideology they will have, what kind of religion they will believe, what kind of legal views about the legal system they will have, intellectual, the contents of their consciousness as exemplified and objectivized in those institutions and ideologies will be determined by their experience of life within the economic system. This is, you can call this economic determinism. Karl Marx is an economic determinist. That means that economic laws determine non-economic, political, and legal institutions. So what is the engine of change? The engine of change is this dialectics, this struggle. What is that? It says, at the stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. Or this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. So you see, material forces of production revolutionize. They change. The steam engine comes along, new technological inventions. Then the existing system, feudal system of ownership cannot accommodate this. It goes into conflict with the material forces of production. And this conflict eventually creates something new, creates a system of capitalistic private profit. That's the social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation. Now, the next phase of the revolution, once the capitalistic property was created and when changes in the modes of production and material forces brings about first changes in the relations of production, changes in the material, in the way how production is regulated, who is in charge. In the economic realm, politics is still far ahead. Political reform, political change is still far ahead. Once that happens, through this dialectic conflict between the new bourgeois class and the old aristocracy, that's what Marx analyzes eventually. So bourgeois will win first. They will win in economics, and then the changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the changes, to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. So that's the next phase. This thing up here, superstructure will be changed. So you see, forces of production or modes of production change for the first time. Technology changes. Then this leads to the changes in the relations of production, how the economy is organized, how the ownership is allocated, how the benefits and costs are allocated. And then, once that happens, you will have the changes in the superstructure, changes in the political system. The changes in the political system will always follow or lag behind the changes in the economic conditions. It's economic or technological determinism. So Marx's theory about how the state emerged, it's one of the competing theories the state. So what are the theories about how the state emerged? What is the most conventional one in the history of philosophy that we read? Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes, all of them have variations of the same theory. Social contract theory. So people who live in the state of nature without the state, and they see some problems, and they don't like that, and they say, okay, we can solve our problems by delegating power to some monopolistic agency of coercion, which is called the state, and then authorize it to do the justice or to impose penalties on transgressors to control society. So state emerges by a hypothetical social contract among individuals who perceive certain problems in a state of society in which there is no government. And they try to solve it by making this social contract. That's the predominant view of how the state government emerged. In Karl Marx's view, it's completely different. He says, no, actually, what happened first was the agricultural revolution in the Bronze Age. An increase in agricultural productivity that led to social stratification. A minority of people with more food, wealthier people, and poorer people. And wealthier people were afraid for their own economic advantages that they created in this class society. So then they created the state as an instrument of protecting their class privileges. That's Karl Marx's idea. The state is just an instrument of protecting wealthy, dominant class in society against the subjugated class, and to use it as an instrument of subjugating for them. He says at one point in Communist Manifesto, the state, the government in a capitalist system is just an executive committee of the bourgeoisie. That's what the state is. The executive committee of the bourgeoisie. Nothing else. They can forget about social contract and laws and division of power and all that nonsense. That's all fine. What state is the instruments in the hands of economically powerful people to retain their privileges and to keep everyone else down. Okay, any questions, comments? Yeah, just.
Well, I'm just thinking about using this model as pyramid. To me, it seems like today, with the increase of technology, it changes the mode of production, which then is going to change the relations between the employer and the employee.
Yeah.
There's going to be less employees or whatever, and it seems to me that could very well change the state as well.
The problem with Marx is that some of his ideas are lulu, but there is a this is not nonsense. You're right.
The same thing happened.
Yeah, the same thing is happening to some degree.
With the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
Did that follow?
Yeah, you can say. Simple. I'll give you one example that conclusively proves that he was right to some degree in this regard. You have this problem of industrial pollution, externalities, and so on, the third-party effects, the factories are emitting sulfur dioxide and polluting the environment and so on. Traditional British common law that has a very powerful safeguards against that. It's called the law of strict liability. Right? Strict liability, whatever damage you create, you will have to pay for it. The problem was created in the 19th century by relaxing some of those guarantees in the name of economic progress. The courts in the 19th century said, economic progress is more important than your right to protect your property against pollution. The companies do not have to pay damages to people whose property they damage by polluting the environment. So you can say that this process of capitalist development in the 19th century led to a certain change in the legal system that would have been impossible in the absence of that development. And there are a variety of other let's say, avenues through which changes in material condition affect our political institutions, our religion, our ideologies, and so on. So that's the problem with Marx. It's not that this is complete nonsense, but the problem is that it's too one-sided. So don't tell me that the 100 years war, how are you going to explain? Jess already asked one difficult question for a Marxist to explain. Who was the oppressor, who was the oppressed in the peasants' rebellions in Germany? Religious wars in Europe that raged for 150 years. About the details or whatever, Trinity. People slaughtered each other for decades. The population of Europe was decimated. What was the material basis for that? There hasn't been any meaningful dramatic change in the economic conditions of Europe in the 16th century, early 17th century. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 marked the end of this religious slaughter in Europe. It seems that sometimes those things that pop up here can are independent from what's going on, and even more significantly, they can influence what's happening down there. And then you had Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, dramatic change in the material conditions, and yet somehow you didn't have dramatic political changes in the last 30, 40 years. That's period maybe of the most dramatic change in the material conditions of life, and yet political changes are not so pronounced as in some periods in which there was less changes in material conditions. Let's say, I mean, when I was of your age, the mode of production for a young intellectual was typing whatever you had to type on a typewriter. I was working as a journalist when I was a student, part-time, full-time. What I would be doing, actually writing my articles, whatever, I was writing some stupid reports, whatever. That they were not going to give me to write op-eds at that time. But you would write whatever you had to write, some summary of a press conference by some minister or something in longhand, and then you go home and then you type it on a typewriter, and then you go to the to office and hand in to the editor your paper, and then he pencils in changes and then type it once again, and then you send the final version to be printed. Compare that with the production process right now. If you can work for a newspaper in India or Russia without ever knowing anyone. The pace of technological changes is breathtaking. And yet the political institutions do not seem, and religious cultures do not seem so tremendously different from what they have been 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So you see what I mean here. It's not that he's right or wrong. That it's just that it's too one-sided. It's too extreme. That's why he was influential. If you are kind of wishy-washy, middle of the road, maybe on the one hand, on the other hand guy, it's not very likely that you're going to influence the course of history. If you say this is one variable, one parameter that controls the entire history. If we can switch it off or switch it on, we can create all kinds of marvels. And always there has to be the scapegoat, somebody who is to blame. Some bad guy, some Satan who is preventing the God's will from being carried out. That's a capitalist society. Now, economic. You definitely will not be able to finish off discussion of Marx today. I've tried to give you just two or three more pieces of information about Marx's theory. Now, mechanics of this capitalism to socialism change. So this is the general scheme. It goes from modes of production, industrial system of production, relations of production which are capitalistic relations of production of private property, and exploitation of labor by capital. they create class conflict between the bourgeois and or capitalists and workers. And this class struggle will lead eventually to the communist revolution. The overthrow, first the overthrow of the system relations of production, capitalist relations of production, and eventually change entire culture at the end of history. What is the mechanics of this change? Mechanics or parameters of this class struggle? Theory of exploitation. What is exploitation? That's the appropriation of the surplus value. Surplus value, another term, by capitalists. Surplus value, the concept of surplus value is based on the labor theory of value. Karl Marx accepts, as I already mentioned a couple of times, accepts the concept of the labor theory of value from the British classical political economy, from Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, and everyone in between, except for Malthus, remember, who rejected it, but didn't provide an alternative. Nevertheless, he rejected it. And Jean-Baptiste Say, who already is flirting with the subjective theory of value, but Marx ignores Say by and large. So labor theory of value Marx insists that Marx's version of the labor theory of value is that what determines the exchange value, he distinguishes still the use value and exchange value. That's we had from Adam Smith to Karl Marx. Use value is something, the value in consumption. How much something is useful for us as a product, as a commodity. Exchange value is a market price. So he says the quantity of labor invested in producing certain things does not determine the use value, it determines the exchange value. And this, how is labor conceptualized? As the labor time, duration of labor, as he says. Okay, how then to understand that there are different kinds of labor, different qualities of labor. Somebody is more productive, somebody is less productive. Somebody will work more diligently, somebody is lazy, and so on. How to account for these heterogeneities in the concept of labor? Marx finds a solution. He says, what determines the exchange value of goods and services is socially necessary labor time. That would be some average productivity, average labor time that is necessary to produce a commodity under the normal conditions. So you have on page 399. The labor, some people might think that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor spent on it, the more idle and unskillful the laborer, the more valuable would his commodity be, because more time would be required to production. He knows that's not the case. The labor, however, that forms the substance of value, this labor that determines the exchange value or price, is not that kind of arbitrary heterogeneous labor that could be higher or lower and we are lost at sea. No, it's not that. It's homogeneous human labor, homogeneous of one essence. Expenditure of one uniform labor power. Uniform labor power. Okay, that's easier said than done. Let's see further how he defines it. The total labor power of society, which is embodied in the sum total of the values of all commodities produced by that society, counts here as one homogeneous mass of human labor power, composed, though it be of innumerable individual units. Each of these units is the same as any other. So far, as it has the character of the average labor power of society and takes effect as such. which means average out more productive, less productive, up and down. It washes out. Eventually, you reach some average labor time, and then the prices will be calculated. The prices will be determined by this average labor productivity. No more time than is needed on an average, no more than is socially is necessary. And he says, the labor time socially necessary is that required to produce an article under the normal conditions of production. This is the old trick that Smith and Ricardo and the entire classical economy is using whenever in trouble to explain the long-term equilibrium. Say this is the long-term normal prices, average prices. Remember when Turgot talks about, labor determines prices, but the prices fluctuate. And then how to solve this problem? Okay, those are short-term fluctuations, but in the long run, since labor determines the fixed quantity of labor determines prices, prices are fixed in the long run because those are normal long-term prices, and all short-term fluctuations are just fancies of the consumers that are irrelevant for the real price in the long term. So Marx belongs to that tradition, he says that. Essentially, in the long run, the average amount of labor determines prices. Following thing, we're already out of time. The key thing remained to explain the contradiction between labor theory of value and the universal profit rate. What are we gonna do? Okay, I'm gonna write it down. Actually, we will have to finish this definitely next class on Tuesday. At least 10 or 15 minutes we will need to say about Marx's theory, exploitation as surplus value. That's the key that remains. So, and then please read Karl Menger for next time. We will spend most of the class reading Karl Menger, but we will have to finish because this is actually the key one, the key technical point of his economic theory. It would be a shame if we skip it. Okay. One more thing, if you're free tomorrow, 10 o'clock, Butler Hall, I think, I will have a convocation to lecture about how Spanish scholastic theologians of the Dominican and Jesuit orders created modern free market economics. If you're interested in that and have time, please, you are welcome to. There will be Q&As, obviously, not just a lecture.